Okay, right. Good evening. So for the halacha shit tonight, the topic is a part 2, because last week, for those who were here, it was vegetarianism in halacha, and this is the important part 2, vegetarianism in Hashkafa, perhaps the more interesting side. What we said last week was that today, pre-Beis Hamikdash, there is actually no chiyuv to eat meat, according to most poskim. On Shabbos, there is a mitzvah of basar v'dagim v'chol matamim, but there's no obligation to eat meat. And even on Yom Tov, where there's a concept of simcha, and ein simcha b'basar v'yayin, but still most poskim say there is no chiyuv to have meat on Yom Tov, and therefore one could have milchik and parav or whatever on Yom Tov. There's no chiyuv. There's a mitzvah to have it, but no chiyuv. Now that was the summary basically of last week. What we're going to discuss today is vegetarianism in Hashkafa. So it is actually connected to this week's parasha. How so? Because in Parshas Baloscha, if you look at the first box, and if you're listening online, please email me j.golker@gmail.com. You'll see this week's parasha, they complain about the mon. Bnei Yisrael complain about the mon, and they say, Vayomru mi ya'achilenu basar. Who is going to feed us meat? So we remember the good old days back in Mitzrayim, where we would have fish, kishuim, avatichim, and the cucumbers and watermelons and whatever else. All we've got is this mon. And it was a pretext. It was a pretext to complain, but they were asking for meat. So it's a good segue into this topic about vegetarianism. The Gemara Sanhedrin Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis says that Adam HaRishon was the first ever vegetarian. Says the Gemara there in the second box, Omer of Yehuda Marav, Adam HaRishon lo yehut lo basar la'achila. He was not allowed to eat meat. Tichsiv lochem yeh la'ochlo l'chol chayas ha'aretz. For you should be all this vegetation and for all the creatures of the world. For lo chayas ha'aretz lochem, but you should not be able to eat the chayas ha'aretz, the animals of the world. In other words, the vegetation is for you and for the animals, and not the animals are for you. However, when they came out of the teva, that just like the vegetation is for you, so too the animals are also for you, and therefore from the times of Noach they were able to eat meat. Now, some explain the idea that we nowadays should try and emulate this lofty level of Adam HaRishon, Kodim L'Chet. So the Torah on the Torah explains that Adam HaRishon had no desire to eat meat, and the whole concept only came into his mind after he sinned with the Eitz Hadas. There is a very interesting Malbim. Let's take a look at the Malbim inside. This is in Bereshis Perek Tes Pasuk Gimel in Parshas Noach. The Pasuk says that on this Pasuk quoted by the Gemara above, the Malbim says, Ki b'nei Adam hayu gufos b'nei Adam chazakim. People were very strong, and the world pre the flood, pre the Mabul, had not become destroyed. And a person could eat fruit and vegetables, and that would sustain him in the same way that he'd get all his nutrients and protein and everything else from the fruit and vegetables as he would nowadays from meat and other things. But post the Mabul, where the food has become ruined, and a person has been, man has been sort of dispelled to all four corners of the world, and the distant lands and distant islands, and there's hot, and there's cold, there's different temperatures, and he needs meat just to have a healthy diet. And therefore, says the Malbim, pre the Mabul they didn't need it, post the Mabul we need this sort of new balanced diet involving meat. Now, imagine you're sitting at a Shabbos table. It happened to us a few weeks ago. We had some guests. It was some people we hadn't met before. It was on the JLE, whatever, hospitality, whatever it was, and one of them tells us they're a vegetarian. I'm sure it's all happened to you. Sometimes they tell you in advance, sometimes they don't. If they tell you in advance, they prefer not to sometimes because they don't want you to go to extra trouble. We'll eat whatever's here, etc., etc. And you get talking to them, and you want to know why exactly are you a vegetarian? And of course, different reasons are given. So what reasons could be given? Well, a whole bunch of reasons. One reason could be, I just prefer this diet. I don't like meat, it's too heavy or whatever it may be. It could be, for animal welfare. It's cruel to kill animals, let's say. They may tell you for Kabbalistic reasons. Yeah, I want to emulate Adam Rishon, Kodim Achet, etc., etc. Okay? There could be a whole variety of reasons: environmental concerns, health concerns, financial concerns. So we'll go through what some of the issues are, and we'll discuss just from a halachic point of view, or from a Hashkafa really point of view, what does Yiddishkeit say about some of these things. The starting point, interestingly, is the Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara in Pesachim in paragraph 3, Daf Mem Tes on the base says, Tanya, Rabbi Omer, Am ha'aretz asa le'echol basar. It is forbidden for an Amoritz to eat meat. Shenema zois Torah sabehim v'hoif. This is the Torah of the animal and of the chicken. Kala esek but Torah mutalechol basar behim v'hoif. Whoever is engaged in Torah, who learns Torah as Talmud Chacham, he should eat meat and chicken. V'chol she'ein esek but Torah also lechol basar behim v'hoif. Says the Maharsha on this Gemara. Interesting. The Mefarshim discussed this Gemara. But miu yesh ledakdek. I might knock at basar behim v'hoif. V'lo knock at nami dagim. How come all of a sudden we mention meat and chicken, but what about fish? How come the Amoritz is not allowed to eat behemoth oif, but he can eat dogim? What's the difference? Both all types of animals. Says the Maharsha, v'nir lefarish, the vadai ben noach chutelechol kol basar. The Gemara says, we quoted it already, the Gemara says that nowadays we can eat all types of animals. Because it says, K'yerek esim nosati lochem. El Yisrael shekiblu haTorah nitztavu lahavta ben atmei laTorah. Klal Yisrael, who have got kashrus rules, there's certain things we can eat and certain things we can't eat. Val zeh remez bekra zois Torah. What does that mean? When it says in the pasuk zois Torahs ha'adam, dahainu ha'isik b'Torah v'yodea lahavta ben atmei laTorah. The person who knows all the halachas and can eat kosher food, v'chol shar surim hanoigim lachilas basar. Who can eat meat? The person who is well versed in making sure that the food is kosher, because it's complicated. There's shchita, there's malicha. You got to take out all the dam. There's getting rid of the chelev. There's the gitan noshe. There's halachas of basar v'cholov. It's complicated, but fish is quite straightforward. So the Maharsha says that perhaps one of the reasons why some people should refrain from eating meat is kashrus concerns. Now, we'll come back to each one soon, but let's just talk about what the other concerns may be. And just by the way, this concept was not foreign to us in Klal Yisrael. At the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s, many good frum Jews who came from Europe, and they came to America, they came to England, they wouldn't eat chicken, they wouldn't eat meat, because of kashrus concerns. They didn't trust where was this meat, who was the sheikhet, where are the kashrus authorities. Baruch Hashem, 100 plus years later, we have very reputable kashrus authorities, and it's a different world. But kashrus concerns, by and large today in built up Jewish areas, is not really a concern. There, Baruch Hashem, are very reputable kashrus authorities. My mother, when she was a teenager still, used to work for was then known as the Kashrus Commission, what is now as KLBD, and sometimes I show her the Is It Kosher app, and I see the sophistication of today's KLBD and other authorities, and she wells up with tears. How things have moved on in recent decades, and it's true. Now, there's another possible concern, and that is if you look at paragraph C. There's an interesting Abar Benel. The Abar Benel says, this is also the same pasuk in Bereshis Tes Gimel, Lefi shebeharogam habalechaim lachilosim yilmudu midas achzorius. A person who shechts animals or kills animals is going to learn traits of cruelty. So it might have a negative effect on the person's own character. The other concern is that of the Sefer Ikrim of animal welfare that we mentioned. And that's perhaps the most famous concern, that is cruel to animals. Let's say, that is the concern. Now, there is a very important Sefer Ikrim. Let's take a look at this Sefer Ikrim inside. Maimon Gimel, Perek Tesvav, Rabbi Yosef Albo. Now, it says the Sefer Ikrim, Uchshenigla Hashem Yisbarach al Kayin. You know what? I think I'm not going to do it inside. You've got the handout in front of you. Let me just summarize it because I can see it's already moved. Time is moving on. But basically, what the Sefer Ikrim says is that it goes back to Cain and Hevel. Cain, we know, brought a korban of pishton, of vegetation. and Hevel brought an animal offering, why did Cain not bring an animal? Why did he bring some produce of the land? So the Abarbanel explains, because he regarded men and animals as equal, and therefore it's wrong to kill animals. That's what Cain. That was his outlook on life. That was his shitta, and therefore, similar, if you like, to the advocates of modern animal rights. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepted the offering of Hevel, rejected the offering of Cain, and therefore Cain still maintained afterwards that men and animals were equals, and he wrongly concluded that just as man can kill animals, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepted Hevel's offering, well, he was also entitled to take the life of a fellow man, and therefore killing Hevel was acceptable. Now, this began a total breakdown of society, and it culminated in the Mabul. So for those generations, all the way till Noach, it began with this breakdown of society, which was the outlook of Cain. So, after the Mabul, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Noach, you eat meat. And the idea was to impress upon mankind the superiority of man over the members of the animal kingdom. And that's really the explanation of the Rabbi Yosef Albo and the Sefer Ikrim. And therefore, for us to turn around and say it's wrong to kill animals, that's not a Jewish hashkafa. It's not a Jewish hashkafa at all. Now, the concept of tsar balei chaim is animal cruelty is certainly a problem, and therefore the looking after the animals and just feeding them and whatever it may be. There's lots to say on tsar balei chaim, but it's not tsar balei chaim to kill the animal because they're there for our benefit. There are 4 layers of levels in the world. The bottom level is domeim, which is an inanimate object. Then you've got someach, which is something which grows, vegetation. Then you've got chai, which is the animal world. And then you've got medaber, which is the human world. And the medaber has got control, and every level's got control over the level below it. So they give the mashal that in the good old days we would get on a wagon which was driven by a horse. So we're sitting there showing our dominion over the animal kingdom. The horse pulling the carriage, which is made of wood, which is tzomeach, and then that's got metal wheels underneath, which is dominion over the inanimate objects. So there was the order of the levels of society were very clear. And they say that nowadays you just get in your car and the whole thing's gone messed up. But the point is, there is that level that each one has dominion. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the animals for us to use and to eat and to work in the farms and the fields and to use their hides, etc., etc. So that particular objection is not really a hashkafa. There is the Kabbalistic ideal, and that is that Rav Kook, and people quote Rav Kook a lot, that vegetarianism is a Kabbalistic ideal. However, it only relates really to the period after Moshiach. And Rav Kook himself rejects that vegetarianism in today's world is an ideal, because for several reasons. Number one, there are other concerns that we should be focusing on. There are wars going on, and this is not necessarily our primary concern. The result will not be an enhanced respect for animal life, but often a debasement of human life. Often there are other concerns which I've put on the sheet. So let's just go through some of the concerns. So you're sitting there with your vegetarian at Shabbos lunch and ask them why they're vegetarian. So if their concerns are kashrus concerns, I know a certain Rav, he doesn't eat when he goes to chasnas, even though he's going to chasnas of hechsherim of the finest quality, he will always go for the fish or the vegetarian alternative. He says there are, but just more things can go wrong with meat, and therefore he will go for the fish alternative. Okay, but kashrus concerns, Baruch Hashem, we're living in a world where things are much more sophisticated than they were when Jews came over to America and to Europe in the early parts of the 20th century. So that is one possible issue. Health concerns, if a person feels he just enjoys milchik or para food, beseda. If a person, financial concerns, it's too expensive to eat meat, okay, that's the reality. If that's what a reality is, then fine. Animal welfare, again, as we've said from the Sefer Ikrim, that is not a Jewish hashkafa, and on the contrary, that the world was created, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in a way that we're allowed to express our dominion over the animal kingdom and to use them for labor, for work, to eat, hides, etc. That is a Torah Hashkafa. That does not condone tzar ba'alei chayim, doesn't allow mistreatment of animals, and there are lots of tshuvas, and it's another shir maybe about foie gras and all these types of things. That's a separate issue. But tzar ba'alei chayim is definitely has got to be considered, but the shechita itself is not a problem. And other issues affect on human character. Unless you're the sheikhet, that doesn't really affect us. And that's, in V'nos Nechorachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu give brachas for those who carry out His will. And Kabbalistic ideals, like I said, is really relates to the period after Moshiach. So the conclusion is that vegetarian is not rejected by Yiddishkeit as a valid lifestyle, and it very much depends on the reasons. For some individuals, then the reasons are acceptable and they're fine, and some are not. So it depends very much on the reasons why a person would be vegetarian.